Welcome to Plugged In, Exploring Energy, a podcast miniseries with Constellation, where we explore the evolving landscape of energy solutions. I'm your host, Chuck Hanna, Vice President of National Accounts and Solutions at Constellation. In each episode, we bring industry leaders and experts to discuss the latest innovations, challenges, and opportunities in the energy sector.
Hello, I'm Abhinav Krishna, Vice President for Commercialization and Development at Constellation, and I'm sitting in for Chuck Hanna on this episode of the Plugged In, Exploring Energy podcast. Today, we'll discuss key issues around demand-side assets, balancing the electricity grid, incorporating battery storage, and more. On this episode, we're excited to speak with Joe Hayden, North American Sales Leader at GridBeyond. GridBeyond is a Constellation Technology Ventures portfolio company. Joe, welcome.
Good to be here with you as well, Abhinav.
Joe, let's start by telling us about yourself, your role, and your company.
Yeah, so I've been with GridBeyond now for just over 3 years. And GridBeyond's an Ireland-based company, had been in business since 2010. So I've been operating in the demand response space for a very, very long time. In fact, commands a leading market share in the UK as far as delivering these services globally. So not only is GridBeyond based out of their home area of the UK and Ireland, we're also in Japan, in Australia. We came to the US right before COVID hit. You can imagine not a good time to be expanding globally during a global pandemic. But we fought through it and recalibrated ourselves as far as our focus and growth and attention to the U.S. market. And so I joined 3 years ago after having been with a competitor in the DR space for 5 years running ERCOT. We are now in every major market in North America, both doing demand response as well as SaaS delivery for predictive analytics as to what the grid's going to do. And we're also into battery storage and doing some things on that front, both on behind the meter, which is of particular interest to this group with the C&I industry or space, but also front of the meter as well in that area as well.
A key topic we'll discuss today is demand-side assets and management of those assets. Joe, for listeners today who may not be familiar with that term, can you explain what that means and why is it important in today's energy environment?
Yeah, so demand response is essentially, or demand side management is what is the consumer of electricity in the C&I space doing with using that power every single day in off the grid. And of course, the grid, other side of the equation here is the grid generators, those producing electricity. And so as we look at short, medium, and long-term forecasts as to what the grid conditions are evolving, the analogy I like to use is the grid is like a room in a sinking ship. And the ceiling is the generation line, supply of electricity. And the demand is what every C&I and residential user is consuming power every day. And that's the water rising up in the room every day. Sometimes the water rises just a little bit. Sometimes it rises a lot, typically around extreme weather conditions. When this occurs, that it rises very, very high. If we go back 5 years, we had a generation line, a ceiling line, if you will, in the room, in my analogy, that never moved. We had coal plants. We had a lot of oil generation. We had a very, very stable generation line of electricity, but it wasn't very carbon friendly, obviously. When you start adding wind and solar into the mix, now that ceiling starts to collapse in that room, where it never did before, or can come down very precariously into low levels, while the water level still does what it's doing, which is demand, which is rising up and down daily. So that dynamic of watching water rising and the ceiling moving is what a PGM, for example, or an ERCOT, or a MISO or an SPP is monitoring every day. And it's become precariously dynamic with the addition of wind and solar assets to the grid. So the ERCOT or PGMs of the world are watching the reliability of the grid, and reliability is based on supply and demand not getting precariously too close to each other. And of course, the worst case scenario is what we came within 6 minutes of happening in ERCOT back in 2019 when Winter Storm Uri came through. And if those two hit or touch each other, then that's a collapse of the entire electricity grid. So that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is maintaining a good margin between demand and supply. So demand response or demand side assets is bringing C&I customers like yourself, your flexibility of what demand you do use every single day, to being available to an ERCOT or a PJM if needed for a scenario where the water rises too high up in the room and gets too close to or is heading towards the ceiling. And so that is what demand response is. And you can be paid very handsomely for being available to an ERCOT or a PJM in the event that that scenario is unfolding, but you're paid for as an insurance policy by the RTOs to be available if needed, if you participate. So that's what demand response is.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to touch a little bit more on the demand response. Can you touch on what are these programs and where are they available? How do customers, especially commercial industrial customers, participate in these programs? Are they voluntary? Are they mandatory programs? Can you touch on some of the insights of these programs?
Yeah. So I'll kind of continue along with my analogy of water rising in a room of a sinking ship, and that's the demand. And so regardless of what the ceiling might be at, as far as its level of generation capacity to the users and say throughout PJM, there's different programs that give different notification elements as to when you as a user should be available or can be available to respond to help PJM, say, bring the water level down in the room. And so the first mechanism in this, if anybody who's exposed to the real-time price of electricity, the index, if prices for electricity get precariously high or higher than your appetite for operating your business, well, you're going to take action to reduce that cost. And that reaction could be to, say, block and trade your position or stop using electricity, obviously, at a moment when prices get too high. If that does the trick, then PJM takes no further action. We're now just entering into our peak load contribution season coming up this summer, where the 5CP or 5 coincidental peak program has now come into play. And the 5CP program is what are the highest 5 peak intervals of usage and demand on the grid during the course of a full season, typically in the summertime. And what you are trying to do is reduce your contribution, your amount of load you're using during when the grid is at its highest taxed intervals across the entire service territory. So it's completely voluntary. The values of that program just increased this year over last year by almost a 10x in value. You could say that every time you successfully hit a peak by turning off or pausing your business or bringing your flexibility of load into the grid, it's worth about $20,000 a megawatt for you on your bill, which is worth about a third of your utility bill. And it's represented in your transmission and distribution charges. It's completely voluntary. There is no regulatory elements to it whatsoever. It's chasing a carrot. So that's one of the programs. Now, GridBeyond, for example, we are what's known as a qualified scheduling entity. And as a qualified scheduling entity or market participant, in some markets it's also called, we have been approved by PJM to represent a C&I user's load that we bring to PJM to say enroll in this program. So where the 5CP program, being completely voluntary, is dispatched with essentially a day ahead notice. So you're given a notice the day before that says it looks like there's going to be a peak day tomorrow. A confirmation of that notice comes out the morning of saying, yeah, it looks like it's still going forward. And then if it looks like this ends up not being a particular 5 top peak days of the year, shaping up in that afternoon, we'll send a message out that says, or a notice that says, stand down. There's no need to take action. It's not going to be a peak day. And so you avoid an unnecessary dispatch or unnecessary interruption of your business. There are other formal programs in demand response that say PJM operates on, for example, capacity. The capacity market is an enrollment of your load, of your flexible load that you're giving to PJM to say, I can be available during the course of the next year. And I can do that within either a 30-minute, 60-minute, or 120-minute notice, depending on what kind of approval you can get from PGM and the type of load that you have and the type of business that you operate in. The value of that program is worth about $75,000 a megawatt a year. But again, your notification's a bit more narrower, and it is a formal notification. It is a formal process of enrollment that you can take action within that 30, 60, or 120-minute time frame. There's another program called Sync Reserve, which is a 10-minute program. It's called at a different phase in that analogy I was referring to. Where's the water? How high is it rising in the room? Depending on where it's rising is when PGM will dispatch those programs. And so it's anticipating those conditions where demand and supply are getting precariously close. And so there's those type of programs where they'll kick in on the 5CP notice. They'll dispatch on capacity. They may dispatch on sync reserve. They may dispatch on another program that's very, very quick and short response called regulation A or D, which is a matter of seconds. So there's different programs that kick in that based on where the water is rising in the room as to when PGM will dispatch those resources. And as I said, some of those are completely voluntary. Some of those are pre-enrollment with certain criteria that you have to perform. Bottom line is you're chasing carrots to continue to earn those revenue payments that PGM is making to be available if needed when those conditions start to occur on the grid.
Thanks for that, Joe. And thank you for highlighting the customer benefits from participating in various programs. Sounds like a significant benefit for commercial industrial customers. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about GridBeyond and just ask you a question on how does GridBeyond work with customers to identify and address those key challenges that you just highlighted and offer opportunities to help them take advantage of these programs?
Sure. So that scenario that I've kind of shared as the analogy is something we've learned very clearly and acutely in the UK and Ireland. We're on an island. We're on by ourselves. We have to operate very efficiently. We have to coordinate very closely between the user community of electricity and the generation community that's producing electricity. Because if we don't get that right, costs are can be prohibitive as far as competing on the world stage. And so costs being electricity usage being one of the largest costs of any C&I user, it's to everyone's benefit to figure out how to make the grid work as efficiently as possible and economically as possible. So we do that in a number of different ways. And what's very unique about us as a qualified scheduling entity in the DR space is we have three very different facets of how we provide those services and help customers prepare to take advantage of the dynamics and the volatility around these grid conditions that form. And as you can imagine, prices for electricity, prices for availability and the demand response programs become even greater of an opportunity for a consumer like yourself if you can bring flexibility into bear and into being available to the grid operator. So GridBeyond's unique positioning is we have a set of software tools that are based on our AI models, which are figuring out, predicting, calculating what and how is the grid going to operate under what conditions? What prices can we anticipate those spikes or those peaks will occur? When will they occur? If we can identify that, we can give customers the ability to have foresight into preparing your own side of your business on your production schedules, on how you operate in your processes, where were your processes in your site flexible to be able to bring that asset, if you will, to the grid operator who will pay you for that flexibility to help you make money in that process, but give them the ability to have a higher degree of reliability on delivering electricity to everyone. So our three facets are predictive analytics of what's going to happen tomorrow, how to prepare for what's going to happen tomorrow, have the knowledge to be able to feed that into your production schedules and being able to prepare for pre-production on your widget or pre-heat or pre-produce or pre-store certain elements of your operation, whatever it may be, when prices are low, so that when prices do spike or do increase, you've prepared, you've pre-done your process in a way that says I can ride out those peaks during these hours that have been forecasted by the SaaS models that GridBeyond provides, and write out those price points. And if you can avoid those price points, you can really significantly impact your cost of electricity over time. So we have a set of predictive analytics of what's going to happen tomorrow. We sit down with you as an operation and say, okay, where is your flexibility? The traditional approach to demand response is that flexibility resides at the meter or at the site, where it's a complete and total all or nothing kind of scenario. Well, there's a lot of businesses that can operate like that very easily, but there's a lot that don't have that luxury of being able to close certain facets of their operation because they're not flexible. Well, we can at a sub-meter level identify and allocate and capture flexibility in different phases of your plant operation. And by capturing that and understanding the headroom around those assets at a sub-meter level, we can align those capabilities of that pausing ability into what programs in PJM or ERCOT or any of these other markets, based on their notifications, based on their traditional elements of how long you need to dispatch, align with your flexible phases in your operation. And we can do that from a crawl, walk, run standpoint. And by that, I mean, where are you at today as far as how you operate in, say, doing or participating in demand response? Is it a simple email, phone call, or text message? We can meet you there where you're already operating. That's crawling. How do we walk? Walking is, can you do something with automation? Can you do something with more flexibility identified in some of those areas at a sub-meter level? And then running. Do you want to fully automate? Do you want to have the capability to fully automate that process of aligning that flexible loads we've identified and captured into demand response? That automation is kind of scary to some people. It can be that you put it in so it's available if needed. Say, for example, skeleton crews or shifts at night during holidays. It's better to have the automation in place and be able to control it than not having it and wish you had. And that, of course, occurs when we see peak price phases or we see dispatches of demand response during times maybe that aren't necessarily when your normal crew is available or in place. So automation can be a very, very key element of that piece. And then let's look at this in a long-term perspective. Let's just say that, and we've seen this in the UK and Ireland, where there was too fast of a response to building wind and solar. Well, we find out that those resources, while very, very cost friendly when they're there and present, can be interrupted where the wind stops blowing, where the sun stops shining. Costs or prices spike, exposes a lot of people to economics that they don't necessarily want to be exposed to. Well, if that occurs in a very frequent pace, if it occurs more and more over time, that becomes an issue of power quality in operating your business. It becomes a cost issue because economics or prices go up. Well, if those positions of investments that these PJMs or ERCOTs are taking become too aggressive and affect reliability, well, then we can work with you on getting a battery and putting a battery on site to address those power quality issues, address those economics where we're seeing prices become higher, and give you the ability to control your own destiny. So those three phases I talked about: predictive analytics, what's going to happen tomorrow with our AI modeling, complete automation capabilities of how to execute on demand response today and execute and capture those revenues. And then longer term, putting in a battery on site to bypass or to avoid those dynamics and that volatility that's been created if the grid operator is taking too many risks in what they're doing on the generation line.
Thank you for that, Joe. I do wanted to touch a little bit on the technology. You touched and highlighted various benefits of the technology. Just wanted to get your take on some of the industry trends and what is GridBeyond doing to stay ahead of those trends, advancements or innovation that you're currently working on. And as we think about the data economy and data center customers, how would data center customer leverage GridBeyond technology?
Sure. So, the traditional data center has not been a good market for demand response. They're very concerned about that transition of, say, moving from, core grid power into backup power is something they only want to do if by no other means they have to do it as a backup power scenario. So So that traditional, kind of model has been reserved strictly for an outage or an emergency. Now, some backup generation has been brought into bear as far as putting into demand response. But again, the traditional data center is very concerned about, making that transition unless they absolutely have to do it. And of course, they're having to deal with, their service level agreements and uptime agreements as far as the reliability they have to deliver. What we've seen is a transition from that traditional sense in data centers into dynamic data centers on the AI platforms where they can be very dynamic. And demand response traditionally maybe looked on as an all or nothing kind of scenario, when in fact it's very, very incremental. And, one of the unique things about the GridBeyond is our background, our DNA comes from a controls background. And from a controls background, that means that when you do a retrofit or an upgrade to a device, a component, a phase of your operation, it essentially migrates or upgrades from a on-off kind of scenario to a variable speed, variable temperature, variable pressure, variability. Variability means flexibility. Flexibility means can capture certain increments of electricity and bring that into a demand response program. And the PJMs, the ERCOTs, the MISOs, the SPPs of the world, they are equal opportunity megawatt harvesters. So they want to capture as much flexibility from users like yourself as they can. And in the data center space, the AI data centers especially, they're very, very dynamic. So by that, I mean they can transition from high scale, high processing kind of scenarios to slow down, maintain the integrity of the packet of information that it's processing. That slowing down of that kind of phase can then be load that is then brought in as flexibility into these demand response programs where they can be monetized and paid for by these demand response programs as another source of revenue. That scenario of kind of identifying and aligning to that flexibility can also be done from a carbon capture standpoint. So we can capture different phases of the grid where it's higher in reduced carbon than say other phases, and matching that power usage into those elements when the grid is say a higher level of reduced carbon capture or consumption with other phases. So there's a lot of different elements where we're lining up both from a monetary standpoint as well as a carbon capture standpoint, the ability to track and capture and measure those elements where we can impact your operations from a sustainability standpoint.
Great. Thank you. You talked about customers. In this case, you were referring to data center, but just general overall, customers may need flexibility in their operations to participate in these programs. What if a customer doesn't have significant flexibility in their operations? Are they able to participate in some of the programs that you had mentioned earlier on?
Yeah. So part of what we do as a business, I mean, there are some industries that are known traditionally to have a lot of flexibility. Cold storage, various phases of a cement plant, phases of an industrial gas plant, steel mills can come up and down very quickly, especially the arc furnaces, if you will. But not all industries have that kind of general flexibility to be brought into demand response. And one of the key aspects of identifying the ability of say, non-traditional businesses to do that is to isolate locations within a phased operation where there is headroom, where there is ability to store or to temporarily buy time, for lack of a better term, so that can be captured into a demand response program. And again, it's aligning the ability of capturing that headroom at a sub-meter level with programs within a PJM or an ERCOT that align to how much notification does that phase of your operation need? How much headroom does that phase of your operation provide? Where do we align those phases of those elements in your facility with particular programs within an ERCOT or a PJM that align to that flexibility? Typically, can you align that flexibility and isolate it for a program that provides a notification of 10 minutes, a notification of 30 minutes, a notification of 4 hours, a notification of a day ahead? We'll look at where are these programs What are the monetary values of these programs? How do they align with those phases of flexibility you have in your operation? Are you exposed to the index? Can you adjust your production schedules of what we call process or optimization to align to when we think or predict there's going to be prices that will spike in certain areas? All those things are taken into consideration as we analyze where we can help monetize the value of your flexibility into these demand response programs. And I would say, Abhinav, in the longer term aspects of demand response, there's economics that are playing into upward pressures of what these values, these programs are, and constantly changing, as well as downward pressures as to what the values of these programs are. And, in PJM, we just recently saw a pretty good example of what these upward pressures, what does the forward-looking curves look like as far as demand goes, and how is that playing into the price of electricity on the forward curve? We just saw a 10x increase in what a customer needs to look at in PJM to impact their PLCs. That 10x increase indicates there's a huge on the horizon demand requirement for power, which means costs and prices are probably going to go up. So the key thing is get into demand response, participate in it. It may not be worth as much today as it is tomorrow or the next day, but it does change. And like we see in anything, there is cyclical elements of values and prices. The important thing is get into it, participate in it, and over time, I think it's something that certainly helps the electricity grid, helps reliability for everyone, and is certainly a worthwhile cause, both from a standpoint of helping reliability of the grid, but also from a monetary standpoint as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Was there a question we have not asked today that you expected or you wanted to address, an area that I have not asked you today? So just wanted to give you the floor.
I think we've covered it. I guess I would say DR today is not, say, your father's demand response or demand management programs that you may have been familiar with in the past. It's become a much more sophisticated, much more innovative based program. And, the grid is becoming more sophisticated. There's demand response providers out there that are not and have not done things differently in providing this service since they began. I mean, some go back 10 years ago. Email, voice, and text message doesn't cut it. It may be on a very simplistic standpoint, but as we see AI coming into play in predicting where we're seeing volatility phases, where we're seeing price peaks, where we're seeing price points, I mean, that is true opportunity. And the way I would look at demand response going forward, with volatility that we've seen and the exposure to that volatility, those risks that are occurring, because that can happen with wind, it can happen with solar. That volatility can cause significant spikes in the delivery of electricity. Being involved in a very sophisticated approach, both short, medium, and long term, and kind of what I used earlier was a crawl, walk, and run scenario in participating in demand response, is an opportunity that essentially in the future, we may be looking at and saying to you, these hours tomorrow are where you should be spending time in your widget business. But there's scenarios that we're seeing based on our predictive analytics and our AI modeling that says you may be better served and make more money in carving out some of those hours in the power business. And that's what demand response, that's what demand management allows you to do. And that's economic opportunity. It's a hedge of your business to be able to provide alternative revenue streams than your core business. And I think at the end of the day, long term, that's a good thing to bring to your business and your companies.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the insights and, helping understand the demand side programs and benefits to the customer, sharing GridBeyond technology can help support customers' needs. So thank you so much and appreciate your time.
Thank you. And we're very, very fortunate and very thankful to be a good partner of Constellation and look forward to great things to come.
This is Deborah Channel from Smart Energy Decisions. We're really thrilled to have Constellation as part of Smart Energy Voices. I want to thank Chuck Hanna and the team from Constellation for making this miniseries possible. And as always, thank you to our listeners for being part of the Smart Energy Decisions community. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, and don't forget to tell your colleagues and peers about it too. To learn about how you can become part of our online and in-person content, visit our website at smartenergydecisions.com. We're always excited to share these presentations from leaders of the energy transition. We do that in this podcast, on our website, and at our events, and it's all in the interest of helping you make those smart energy decisions.